The morning mist hung over Seabrook Harbor like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of fishing boats preparing for another day at sea. Liana Rodriguez stood on the weathered dock, her weathered hands checking the nets she had mended the night before. At 52, her dark hair was streaked with silver, and deep lines around her brown eyes spoke of years spent squinting against sun and salt spray. She moved with quiet efficiency, her movements precise despite the early hour. The other fishermen respected her skill and her silence. In the 3 years since she had arrived in Seabrook, she had spoken only when necessary, keeping her past locked away like treasure in a sunken chest. "Morning, Liana," called out Tom Bradley, captain of the vessel moored next to hers. "Looks like good weather for fishing today." "Should be fine," she replied, her voice carrying a slight accent that reminded people she had come from somewhere else. She never spoke of where. Her boat, the Silent Grace, was small, but well-maintained. Liana had bought it with the last of her savings when she first came to town. The name wasn't painted on the hull. She preferred anonymity, even in this small detail. As she prepared to cast off, Liana caught sight of her reflection in the harbor water. For a moment, she saw not the weathered fisherman she had become, but the young doctor she had once been. The memory hit her like a cold wave. Dr. Liana Rodriguez, age 28, working in the mountain village of San Miguel. The accident at the mine, the injured workers, the screaming families, her hands covered in blood, unable to save them all. The guilt that followed her like a shadow. She shook her head, pushing the memories away. That life was over. That person was gone. Now she was just Liana, the quiet fisherman who brought in good catches and bothered no one. The Silent Grace puttered out of the harbor as the sun began to burn through the mist. Seabrook was waking up behind her, the bakery opening, children walking to school, the daily rhythm of a small coastal town. It was peaceful here, far from the mountains and the memories that haunted them. Liana had chosen this place carefully. Seabrook was small enough that newcomers were noticed, but not questioned too deeply. The people were kind, but respected privacy. It was the perfect place to disappear. She anchored her boat at her usual spot, 2 miles from shore where the water was deep and the fish were plentiful. The work was honest and simple. Cast the nets, wait, pull them in, sort the catch. No life and death decisions. No one counting on her skill to survive. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent 12 years saving lives, and now she spent her days taking them, even if they were just fish. But it was better this way, safer. No one could die because of her mistakes. As she worked, Liana's mind drifted to the early days in San Miguel. Fresh out of medical school, full of hope and determination to help people in remote areas where doctors were scarce. She had been good at her job. Excellent, even. The mountain people had trusted her completely. Until the day she failed them. The mine collapse had happened on a Tuesday morning in spring. 23 men trapped underground, some injured, others fighting for air in the darkness below. She had worked for 18 hours straight, her hands steady despite the exhaustion, her mind focused despite the chaos around her. She had saved 19 of them. 4 had died. Logic told her that saving 19 lives out of 23 was remarkable. Other doctors praised her work. Government officials called her a hero. But logic couldn't silence the voices of the 4 families who had lost everything. Why couldn't you save my husband? You're supposed to be a doctor. If you were better, my son would still be alive. The accusations had been cruel and unfair, born from grief and desperation. But they had found their mark in Liana's heart. She began to doubt herself, second-guessing every decision, seeing failure where others saw success. 6 months later, She had quietly resigned from her position and disappeared from the medical world entirely. She had driven for days, finally stopping when she reached the coast and could go no farther. Seabrook had welcomed her without questions, and she had been grateful for the anonymity. The fish were biting well that morning. Liana's nets came up heavy with the silver bodies of mackerel and sea bass. It was good work, honest, simple, and harmless. No one's life depended on her skill with the nets. As she sorted her catch, Liana noticed storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The weather had been calm when she left the harbor, but conditions could change quickly on the water. She checked her radio and heard the weather service issuing small craft advisories for later in the day. Time to head back. The Silent Grace cut through the choppy water toward Seabrook Harbor. Other fishing boats were also making their way to shore, their captains reading the same signs in the darkening sky. Liana had learned to respect the sea in her 3 years as a fisherman. It was beautiful but dangerous, offering both livelihood and death with equal indifference. The harbor came into view, its stone breakwater offering protection from the open ocean. Liana could see people on the docks, tourists taking pictures, locals preparing for the approaching weather. It was a normal day in a normal town, the kind of day she had learned to appreciate for its very ordinariness. She was tying up the Silent Grace when she heard the first screams. The screams cut through the harbor sounds like a knife through canvas. Liana looked up from securing her boat to see people running along the waterfront, pointing toward the harbor mouth. In the distance, black smoke was rising from the water. "There's been an accident!" shouted Mrs. Henderson, who ran the harbor gift shop. "A tour boat hit the rocks!" Liana felt her blood turn cold. Through the gathering dusk and thickening weather, she could make out the shape of a large vessel listing badly near the rocky point that guarded the harbor entrance. Even from a distance, she could see people in the water. Tom Bradley was already untying his boat. "I'm going out there," he called to the gathering crowd. "Anyone who can help, come on." Several other fishermen began preparing their boats for rescue work. Liana stood frozen on her dock, her hands gripping the mooring lines so tightly her knuckles went white. "Not again," she thought. "I can't do this again." But even as her mind recoiled from the situation, her trained eye was assessing what she could see. The tour boat had at least 40 people aboard. She could see them in the water, some clinging to debris, others swimming toward shore with desperate strokes. "Liana," Tom called out, "your boat's fast and shallow draft, perfect for getting close to those rocks?" She wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away, go to her small apartment above the hardware store, and pretend this wasn't happening. But her feet were already moving, her hands already starting the Silent Grace's engine. The harbor was chaos. Rescue boats were launching from every available slip, while people on shore organized themselves into emergency groups. Someone had called the Coast Guard, but their station was 50 miles away. The people in the water had minutes, not hours. The Silent Grace bounced through the harbor chop, spray flying over her bow as Liana pushed the engine harder than she ever had. Behind her, other boats followed, but hers was indeed the fastest and most maneuverable for the rocky waters around the point. As they approached the accident scene, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The tour boat Seabrook Queen had somehow veered off course in the gathering storm and struck the notorious Devil's Teeth rocks. The impact had torn a massive hole in her hull, and she was sinking fast. People were everywhere in the water. Some wore life jackets, others did not. Children were crying for their parents, adults were shouting for help, and the lucky ones were clinging to floating debris from the wreckage. "Take us in as close as you can!" Tom shouted over the engine noise. He had brought 2 other men from his crew, and they were already preparing rescue equipment. Liana maneuvered the Silent Grace between the jagged rocks with skill born of 3 years fishing these waters. Her hands were steady on the wheel, her eyes reading the water like a familiar book. But inside, she was fighting a battle between her desire to help and her terror of failing again. They reached the first group of survivors, a family of 4 clinging to a floating cooler. The father had a gash on his head, and the mother looked to be in shock. Their 2 children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, were terrified but uninjured. "We've got you," Tom called out, throwing them a rope. "Hold on tight!" One by one, they pulled the family aboard the Silent Grace. The father's head wound was bleeding freely, and Liana found herself automatically assessing his injury with the trained eye she had tried so hard to forget. Scalp laceration, probably needs sutures, but not immediately life-threatening. Check for concussion symptoms. Monitor for shock. She pushed the medical thoughts away, focusing on piloting the boat toward the next group of survivors. But as they pulled more people from the water, it became clear that some were injured more seriously than others. A teenage boy had a broken arm that was bent at an unnatural angle. An elderly woman was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. A middle-aged man was coughing up seawater and seemed to be having trouble staying afloat even with his life jacket. "We need to get the worst ones to shore first," Tom said, his face grim. "The ambulances are waiting at the dock." Liana nodded, but her mind was racing. She could see at least a dozen more people still in the water, and some of them were clearly in distress. The Coast Guard helicopter was just a dot on the horizon, still too far away to help. As they headed back toward the harbor with their first load of survivors, one of the rescued passengers grabbed Liana's arm. "Please," the woman gasped, water still streaming from her hair. "My husband is still out there. He couldn't swim very well, and I lost sight of him when the boat went down. You have to find him." Liana looked back at the wreckage area, where other rescue boats were still pulling people from the water. In the growing darkness and rough seas, it was becoming harder to spot survivors. Some might be missed. Some might not make it. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy coat. These people were counting on the rescue boats to save everyone. They were counting on her. "But I'm just a fisherman now," she told herself. "I'm not responsible for anyone's life." Even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't true. She had skills that could help these people, not just her boat handling, but her medical training. In a disaster like this, every qualified person made a difference. They reached the dock where paramedics were waiting to take the injured survivors to the small regional hospital. But as Liana looked at the growing number of casualties, she realized the hospital would quickly be overwhelmed. Seabrook's medical facilities were designed for a town of 3,000 people, not a mass casualty event like this. "How many more are still out there?" asked Sarah Martinez, the lead paramedic. "At least 15, maybe 20, Tom replied grimly. "And some of them looked pretty bad." Sarah's face was tight with worry. "We've got 3 ambulances, and they're already full. Dr. Peterson is at the hospital preparing for casualties, but he's the only doctor in town right now. If we get serious trauma cases..." She didn't finish the sentence. Everyone understood. Dr. Peterson was a good family physician, but he wasn't equipped to handle major trauma. The nearest trauma center was 2 hours away by ambulance, longer in this weather. Liana watched the paramedics work on the survivors they had just brought in. Her trained eye could see what the overwhelmed EMTs might miss: signs of internal bleeding, symptoms of head trauma, the subtle indicators that separated the walking wounded from those in real danger. The elderly woman has signs of shock, probably internal injuries. The teenager with the broken arm might have damaged nerves or blood vessels. The man who was coughing up seawater could have aspirated fluid into his lungs. Without thinking, she stepped forward. "The woman in the blue jacket. She needs IV fluids and immediate transport. Possible internal bleeding." Sarah looked up, surprised. How do you know that? Liana felt the eyes of everyone on the dock turning toward her. She had spoken with the authority of medical training, revealing knowledge that a simple fisherman shouldn't possess. I used to be a paramedic, she lied quickly. Long time ago. It wasn't technically true, but it was closer to the truth than anyone in Seabrook knew. Sarah nodded gratefully. Then we could really use your help. We're going to be swamped tonight. Liana wanted to refuse, to step back into the shadows and let someone else take responsibility. But more survivors were arriving, and she could see that some were seriously injured. The local medical system was already straining under the load. I'll do what I can, she heard herself say. As if summoned by her words, Tom appeared at her elbow. Liana, we need to go back out. There are still people in the water, and the weather's getting worse. She looked out at the harbor mouth, where rescue boats continued to work in the growing darkness. The storm that had caused the accident was intensifying, making the rescue work more dangerous by the minute. But there were still people out there, people who might not survive if every available boat didn't keep searching. Let's go, she said quietly. As the Silent Grace headed back into the rough water, Liana made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't save everyone. She had learned that bitter lesson years ago in the mountains. But she could try to save as many as possible. For the first time in 3 years, Dr. Liana Rodriguez was going back to work. The second rescue run was harder than the first. The storm had arrived in full force, turning the harbor mouth into a churning cauldron of white water and wind. The Silent Grace bucked like an angry horse as Liana fought to keep her on course toward the wreckage site. I can barely see anything in this weather, Tom shouted over the wind. Liana squinted through the spray-covered windscreen, using her knowledge of the local waters to navigate by memory and instinct. The lighthouse beams swept across the chaos every 30 seconds, providing brief moments of visibility in the storm-darkened evening. They found 3 more survivors clinging to a piece of the tour boat's deck railing. 2 were children, maybe 12 and 14 years old, and an adult woman who appeared to be their grandmother. All 3 were showing signs of hypothermia, blue lips, violent shivering, confusion. Got them, Tom called as they pulled the survivors aboard. But as they wrapped the children in emergency blankets, Liana could see that the older woman was in serious trouble. Her shivering had stopped, which was actually a bad sign. Her speech was slurred, and her movements were sluggish. Advanced hypothermia, Liana diagnosed silently. Core temperature probably below 90 degrees. She needs immediate rewarming and medical attention. We need to get her to the hospital right away, she told Tom. She's going into severe hypothermia. Tom looked at her with surprise. How do you know all this medical stuff? Before Liana could answer, one of the children, a girl about 12, suddenly began having trouble breathing. Her lips were turning blue, and she was making harsh, gasping sounds. Respiratory distress. Could be water in the lungs, could be shock, could be an allergic reaction to something. Liana acted without thinking. She knelt beside the girl, her hands moving with practiced skill to assess the situation. She tilted the child's head back slightly, checked her pulse, listened to her breathing pattern. She's aspirated seawater, Liana announced with certainty. Her lungs are full of fluid. We need to get her upright and keep her airways clear. What are you, some kind of doctor? Tom asked, but he was already helping Liana position the girl properly. The question hit Liana like a physical blow. For a moment, she was back in the mountains, in the emergency clinic, with families screaming at her because she hadn't been able to save their loved ones. What kind of doctor lets people die? If you were any good, my husband would still be alive. But this child was still alive, still breathing, still fighting. And Liana's hands knew what to do, even if her heart was breaking. She worked with the girl for several minutes, keeping her airways clear, monitoring her breathing, watching for signs of improvement. Gradually, the child's color improved and her breathing became less labored. "Is she going to be okay?" the grandmother asked weakly. "She's going to be fine," Liana said, and meant it. "But she needs to get to the hospital for proper treatment." As they headed back to shore with their latest group of survivors, Tom studied Liana with new eyes. "You're not just a paramedic, are you? Nobody learns that kind of skill from EMT training." Liana focused on steering the boat through the rough water, avoiding his gaze. "I picked up some things over the years." But she could feel his eyes on her, and she knew her secret was starting to unravel. The medical knowledge was too deep, too instinctive to be anything but professional training. She had tried to be careful, but in crisis situations, instincts took over. They reached the dock to find organized chaos. More survivors had been brought in by other rescue boats, and the small harbor area was crowded with paramedics, police officers, Coast Guard personnel, and volunteers from the town. Someone had set up a triage area under the harbor lights, sorting the injured by severity of their conditions. Dr. Peterson, Seabrook's only physician, was moving between patients with controlled urgency. But Liana could see the strain on his face. He was a family doctor, not an emergency physician, and some of these injuries were beyond his normal experience. A man in Coast Guard uniform approached them as they tied up. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Walsh," he said. "How many more are still out there?" "Maybe 6 or 8, Tom replied. "But the weather's getting worse. It's going to be nearly impossible to spot anyone in these conditions." Walsh nodded grimly. "We've got a helicopter coming from Portland, but it won't be here for another hour. And this weather might ground it anyway." As they helped transfer their latest survivors to the triage area, Liana couldn't help but observe the medical situation. Several patients were showing signs of serious trauma that weren't being addressed. Not because of negligence, but because there simply weren't enough qualified medical personnel to handle everything. A man with obvious internal injuries was being treated for minor cuts while his blood pressure dropped dangerously. A woman with a head injury was conscious and talking, but Liana could see the subtle signs of increasing intracranial pressure that the overwhelmed EMTs had missed. They're going to lose people, she realized. Not because they're not trying, but because they're missing the signs that separate minor injuries from life-threatening ones. Dr. Peterson appeared at her elbow, looking harried and exhausted. "Tom tells me you have medical training. We could really use some help here." Liana hesitated. Stepping forward would mean revealing her true identity, ending 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity. But looking around at the injured survivors, she realized she didn't have a choice. "What do you need me to do?" she asked quietly. "Can you help with triage? Sort the patients by how serious their injuries are? I'm the only doctor here, and I can't assess everyone fast enough." Liana looked at the crowd of injured people, some sitting on the dock, others lying on stretchers, all of them depending on the medical team to save their lives. It was the nightmare scenario she had been avoiding for 3 years, people counting on her skill to survive. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. She had Dr. Peterson, the paramedics, the Coast Guard medical team that would arrive with the helicopter. She was part of a team, not the sole person responsible for life and death. "I can help," she said. What followed was a 2-hour medical marathon, unlike anything Seabrook had ever seen. Liana moved through the triage area with quiet efficiency, her trained eye quickly identifying the patients who needed immediate attention versus those who could wait. She worked alongside Dr. Peterson, her suggestions offered quietly and professionally. When she recommended that the man with internal injuries be moved to the front of the transport queue, the doctor listened. When she identified signs of air embolism in a diver who had been helping with the rescue, her diagnosis probably saved his life. "Where did you train?" Dr. Peterson asked during a brief lull in the action. "University of Mexico," Liana replied truthfully. "Long time ago." "You're not just a paramedic, are you? You're working like someone with full medical training." Before Liana could answer, the Coast Guard helicopter finally arrived, bringing with it a trauma team from Portland General Hospital. The helicopter landing area filled with purposeful activity as the most seriously injured survivors were prepared for transport to the city's major trauma center. Dr. Jennifer Kim, the trauma surgeon from Portland, took charge of the most critical patients with brisk efficiency. But as she worked, she kept glancing at Liana with curious eyes. "That woman over there," she said to Dr. Peterson, nodding toward Liana. "She's been making spot-on medical assessments all evening. Who is she?" "Says she's a paramedic, but she's working like a physician. I think she might have more training than she's admitting to." Dr. Kim watched as Liana helped stabilize a patient with a punctured lung, her movements precise and confident. "She's definitely had surgical training. Look at how she's handling that chest tube placement. That's not paramedic-level skill." As the most critical patients were loaded into the helicopter for transport to Portland, the immediate crisis began to wind down. Of the 43 people who had been aboard the Seabrook Queen, 39 had been successfully rescued. 4 were still missing, presumably lost in the wreck or swept out to sea by the storm. 39 saved, 4 lost, Liana thought, the familiar guilt beginning to creep in. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't alone with the responsibility. This time, she had been part of a team that had done everything humanly possible. As the last ambulance pulled away from the harbor, Dr. Peterson approached Liana with a cup of coffee and a thoughtful expression. "I don't know who you really are," he said quietly. "But tonight you probably saved several lives with your assessments. Thank you." Liana accepted the coffee gratefully, her hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Peterson said firmly. "You did what a trained physician would do. Your knowledge, your instincts, your clinical judgment, that comes from years of medical practice, not paramedic training." Tom Bradley joined them, still dripping from the rescue operations. "Whatever your story is, Liana, tonight you were a hero. Those people in the water, the ones we brought to shore, you helped save them." Liana looked out at the harbor, where lights from the Coast Guard vessels still swept the water, searching for the 4 missing passengers. The storm was beginning to clear, but the search would continue through the night. 39 people were alive tonight because of the combined efforts of everyone involved in the rescue. She had played a part in that, not the sole savior, not the person carrying all the responsibility, but an important member of the team. For the first time in 3 years, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. The next morning brought crystal clear skies and calm seas to Seabrook Harbor, as if nature was apologizing for the previous evening's violence. Liana stood on her boat dock, watching the Coast Guard vessels continue their search for the 4 missing passengers from the Seabrook Queen. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the survivors they had pulled from the water, heard their voices calling for help, felt the familiar rush of medical emergency response. It was a feeling she had missed more than she cared to admit. "Liana?" She turned to see Dr. Peterson approaching, accompanied by a woman she didn't recognize. An older lady with silver hair and kind eyes, wearing a Coast Guard auxiliary uniform. "This is Margaret Walsh," Dr. Peterson said. "She's coordinating the family services for the survivors." Margaret extended her hand with a warm smile. "Dr. Peterson tells me you were instrumental in the medical response last night. I wanted to thank you personally. Doctor. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Liana shook Margaret's hand politely but shot a warning glance at Peterson. I'm not a doctor, she said quietly. Just someone who helped out. Margaret's eyes were sharp despite her grandmotherly appearance. My granddaughter was one of the children you helped last night. Emma Walsh, the little girl who was having trouble breathing. Liana remembered the 12-year-old with the aspirated seawater. Is she doing well? She's fine, thanks to your quick thinking. The doctors in Portland said you probably prevented serious complications by keeping her airways clear. Margaret paused, studying Liana's face. They also said that whoever treated her had advanced medical training, the kind that takes years to develop. Before Liana could respond, Tom Bradley jogged up to them, his face flushed with excitement. Liana, you need to see this. He held up his phone, showing a local news website. They're calling you a hero. The headline read, Mystery Woman Helps Save Dozens in Harbor Disaster. Below it was a grainy photo taken during the rescue operations, showing Liana working on one of the injured survivors. The article described how a local fisherman with apparent medical training had played a crucial role in the emergency response. Liana felt her stomach drop. They don't know my name, do they? Not yet, Tom said. But people are starting to ask questions. The survivors you helped, the medical team, they all want to thank the woman who knew exactly what to do when it mattered most. Dr. Peterson stepped closer, lowering his voice. Liana, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. Are you a trained physician? The question hung in the air between them. Liana looked at the faces surrounding her. Tom, who had worked alongside her for 3 years without knowing her secret. Dr. Peterson, who had seen her medical skills firsthand. Margaret Walsh, whose granddaughter might not have survived without proper intervention. She thought about the 39 people who had been saved the night before, and how her medical knowledge had helped ensure they received appropriate treatment. She thought about the 4 who were still missing, and how no amount of medical skill could save someone who had already been claimed by the sea. Yes, she said quietly, I'm a doctor. The admission seemed to release something that had been building pressure inside her chest for 3 years. She took a deep breath and continued, My name is Dr. Liana Rodriguez. I graduated from the University of Mexico Medical School 15 years ago. I practiced in mountain communities for 12 years before I came here. What made you stop practicing? Dr. Peterson asked gently. The familiar pain twisted in Liana's chest as she remembered the mine collapse, the injured workers, the families who had lost everything. There was an accident, a mine collapse in San Miguel. I couldn't save everyone. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. How many did you save? 19. Out of how many total? Liana's voice dropped to almost a whisper. 23. The group was silent for a moment, processing the numbers. Finally, Tom spoke up. Liana, you saved 19 people out of 23. That's incredible. I failed 4 families, she replied, the old guilt rising like bile in her throat. 4 men died because I wasn't good enough, fast enough, skilled enough to save them. Dr. Peterson shook his head firmly. That's not failure, Liana. That's medicine. We can't save everyone, no matter how skilled we are or how hard we try. What matters is that we save everyone we can. The families of the 4 men who died didn't see it that way. Margaret stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Dr. Rodriguez, my husband was a Coast Guard rescue swimmer for 30 years. He saved hundreds of people during his career, but he also lost some, people who died despite his best efforts. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He used to tell me that the measure of a rescuer isn't in the people you can't save. It's in the people you do save, and what their survival means to the families who get to hold them again. Liana felt tears stinging her eyes for the first time in months. But the guilt never goes away completely, Dr. Peterson said with understanding. I've lost patients too, Liana. Every doctor has. The guilt is part of the job, but so is the knowledge that for every person we couldn't save, there are many more who are alive because we were there. Tom looked at her with new respect. Is that why you became a fisherman? To get away from medicine? I thought it was safer, Liana admitted. I thought if I wasn't responsible for anyone's life, I couldn't fail them. But last night you were responsible, Margaret observed. You made split-second medical decisions that saved lives. How did that feel? Liana considered the question honestly. Terrifying. But also, right. Like I was doing what I was meant to do. Before anyone could respond, a commotion at the harbor entrance caught their attention. A Coast Guard vessel was approaching, and there were people visible on the deck, not crew members, but civilian passengers. They found some of the missing people, Tom shouted. The small group rushed toward the Coast Guard dock as the vessel tied up. 3 of the 4 missing passengers were helped ashore, cold, exhausted, and injured, but alive. They had been found clinging to debris on a small rocky island about 5 miles from the crash site. As the survivors were helped toward waiting ambulances, one of them, a middle-aged man with a badly injured leg, called out weakly, "Is there a doctor here? Please, I think something's wrong with my leg. I can't feel it anymore." Dr. Peterson started forward, but Liana was already moving. Her trained eye immediately assessed the man's condition, the pale, cold skin, the unnatural position of the limb, the signs of compromised circulation. Compartment syndrome, she diagnosed silently. Blood flow is being cut off by swelling. If it's not treated immediately, he could lose the leg. We need to get you to surgery right away, she told the man, her voice calm and professional. Dr. Peterson, this can't wait for transport to Portland. We need to relieve the pressure in his leg now, or he'll lose it. Dr. Peterson looked at the injured leg and nodded grimly. You're right, but I don't have experience with compartment syndrome surgery. I do, Liana said quietly. The words hung in the air for a moment. Everyone understood what she was offering. To come out of hiding completely, to practice medicine openly, to take responsibility for a life-threatening surgical procedure. Liana, Dr. Peterson said carefully, are you sure? This is major surgery, and if anything goes wrong, she looked at the injured man whose leg was growing paler by the minute. In her mind, she could hear the voices of the families from San Miguel, accusing her of failing their loved ones. But she could also hear Margaret Walsh's words about the people who were alive because she had been there. I'm sure, she said firmly. As they prepared to transport the patient to the small hospital, word spread through the town that the mysterious fisherman who had helped with the rescue was actually a doctor. People began gathering outside the medical center, not as an angry mob demanding answers, but as a community grateful for someone who had risked everything to help their neighbors. Tom Bradley stood among the crowd, still processing what he had learned about his quiet friend. 3 years, he muttered to himself. 3 years I worked alongside a doctor and never knew it. Inside the hospital, Dr. Liana Rodriguez was scrubbing in for her first surgery in 3 years, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. She was no longer hiding from her past, no longer running from the weight of medical responsibility. She was finally ready to heal, both her patients and herself. The Seabrook Community Hospital was small and basic, designed to handle routine medical needs for the local population. It had one operating room, minimal surgical equipment, and was staffed by a skeleton crew during evening hours. As Liana scrubbed her hands and arms with methodical precision, she felt the familiar ritual returning, the careful preparation, the mental checklist, the calm focus that preceded every surgical procedure. Dr. Peterson worked beside her, his movements less assured but equally careful. "When was the last time you performed a fasciotomy?" he asked quietly. "4 years ago," Liana replied honestly. "But it's like riding a bicycle. You don't forget the technique." Through the small window into the operating room, she could see the patient being prepared by the night nurse and a paramedic who had stayed to assist. The man's leg was visibly swollen and discolored, the skin tight and shiny from the pressure building inside the muscle compartments. Time is everything, Liana thought. Wait too long and the tissue dies. Move too fast and you make mistakes. As they entered the operating room, Liana felt the familiar transformation that came with crossing that threshold. She was no longer the quiet fisherman from the harbor. She was Dr. Rodriguez, and she had work to do. "Patient is prepped and ready," announced Nancy Williams, the night nurse. "We've got him under local anesthesia. That's all we have available right now." Liana nodded. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. "Has anyone contacted his family?" "His wife is driving down from Portland," Nancy replied. "She'll be here in about 2 hours." The patient, whose name was Robert Chen, was conscious but groggy from pain medication. "Doc," he said weakly, "am I going to lose my leg?" Liana met his eyes with steady confidence. "Not if I can help it, Mr. Chen. We're going to relieve the pressure and restore blood flow to your leg. You're going to be fine." She hoped she was right. The surgery itself was technically straightforward, but required absolute precision. Liana made long incisions along the length of the man's lower leg, releasing the tight fascial compartments that were crushing his muscles and cutting off circulation. As she worked, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved with practiced skill, each cut deliberate and controlled. Dr. Peterson assisted with quiet competence, following her lead without question. "There," she said as dark blood began flowing from the released compartments. "We're getting circulation back." The change was immediate and dramatic. The patient's leg, which had been pale and cold, began to pink up as blood flow returned to the starved tissues. His pain, which had been constant and severe, began to ease. "I can feel my foot again," Robert said with relief. "The numbness is going away." Liana continued working, cleaning the wounds and checking each muscle group for viability. Most of the tissue looked healthy. They had caught the condition in time. But there was some damage that would require months of physical therapy to fully heal. "You're going to have some scarring," she told Robert as she began closing the incisions. "And you'll need extensive rehabilitation. But you're going to keep your leg, and you should regain full function eventually." As she sutured the surgical sites, Liana became aware of activity outside the operating room. Through the small window, she could see people gathering in the hospital corridor. Not just medical staff, but townspeople who had heard about the surgery. "Looks like you've got an audience," Dr. Peterson observed. Tom Bradley was there, still wearing his fishing clothes from the rescue operation. Margaret Walsh sat in a waiting room chair, her granddaughter Emma beside her, the little girl whose breathing Liana had helped during the rescue. Several other survivors from the boat accident had come to the hospital, some still wearing bandages from their own injuries. "Why are they all here?" Liana asked Nancy. "Word got around town that the woman who helped with the rescue was actually a doctor," Nancy explained, "and that she was performing emergency surgery to save someone's leg. People wanted to show their support." The surgery took 2 hours to complete. When Liana finally emerged from the operating room, pulling off her surgical gloves, She was greeted by spontaneous applause from the people gathered in the corridor. "Dr. Rodriguez," called out Emma Walsh, Margaret's granddaughter. "Thank you for helping me breathe last night." Other voices joined in. "You saved my husband's life. Thank you for pulling us out of the water. We're so lucky you were here." Liana felt overwhelmed by the gratitude, but also something else: acceptance. These people weren't angry at her for not saving everyone. They were grateful for the lives she had saved. Dr. Peterson appeared beside her, having changed out of his surgical scrubs. "The patient is stable and should make a full recovery," he announced to the gathered crowd. Dr. Rodriguez performed flawless surgery under difficult conditions. "How is he doing?" asked a woman Liana didn't recognize. She was well-dressed and looked tired from traveling. "Are you Mrs. Chen?" Liana asked. "Yes, I drove down as soon as I heard. Is Robert going to be okay?" Liana smiled reassuringly. "He's going to be fine. We restored circulation to his leg, and he should regain full function with time and physical therapy. You can see him in a few minutes." Mrs. Chen began crying with relief. "Thank you so much. The Coast Guard told me that if you hadn't recognized what was wrong, he could have lost his leg." As the crowd began to disperse, Margaret Walsh approached Liana with a thoughtful expression. "Dr. Rodriguez, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What are your plans now? Are you going back to fishing, or—" It was the question Liana had been avoiding all evening. Now that her secret was out, now that the entire town knew she was a trained physician, what came next? "I honestly don't know," she admitted. "I haven't practiced medicine in 3 years. I'm not even sure I'm licensed to practice in this state anymore." Dr. Peterson overheard the conversation. "Actually, I looked into that while you were finishing the surgery. Your medical license is still active. You just need to update your address with the state board." "You looked into my license?" "I had to, for insurance purposes. But Liana, I have a proposition for you." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Seabrook needs another doctor. We're underserved medically, especially for emergency situations like what happened tonight." Tom Bradley, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. "The whole town would support that idea. After what you did last night and tonight, everyone knows you're exactly the kind of doctor we need here." Liana looked around at the faces surrounding her, people she had come to know as neighbors and friends during her 3 years in Seabrook, now seeing her in an entirely different light. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said honestly. "The responsibility, the pressure. What if I fail someone again?" "You didn't fail anyone tonight," Margaret said firmly. "You saved my granddaughter's life, you helped coordinate medical care for dozens of accident victims, and you just performed surgery that saved a man's leg? That doesn't sound like failure to me." Emma Walsh, who had been sitting quietly through the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Dr. Rodriguez, when I was in the water last night and couldn't breathe, I was really scared. But when you helped me, I felt safe. That's what doctors do, right? They make people feel safe?" Out of the mouths of children, Liana thought. The 12-year-old had captured something that all of Liana's medical training and years of experience had somehow missed. The essence of healing wasn't just about technical skill or perfect outcomes. It was about being present in moments of crisis, offering skill and compassion when people needed it most. "You're right, Emma," she said softly. "That is what doctors do." As the group finally began to break up, people heading home after the long and emotional day, Dr. Peterson pulled Liana aside one more time. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said, "but think about it. This community could really use someone with your skills and experience. And I think you might find that practicing medicine as part of a team, with community support, feels very different from carrying all that responsibility alone. Liana nodded thoughtfully. I'll consider it. As she walked through the quiet streets of Seabrook toward her small apartment, Liana reflected on how much had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she had been an anonymous fisherman with a buried past. Tonight, she was a doctor again, with a community that had seen her at her best and worst and chosen to embrace her anyway. The guilt from San Miguel was still there. She suspected it always would be. But it was balanced now by something new. The knowledge that her skills could still help people, that her presence in a crisis could still make the difference between life and death. For the first time in 3 years, Dr. Liana Rodriguez was thinking about the future instead of hiding from the past. 2 weeks later, Liana stood in the empty storefront that would soon become Seabrook's second medical clinic. The space was small but well lit, with large windows facing the harbor where her fishing boat still bobbed at its mooring. She wasn't ready to give up the silent grace entirely. Fishing had taught her patience and acceptance that complemented her medical training. The contractors say they can have it ready in 6 weeks, Dr. Peterson said, joining her in the empty space. Exam rooms, a small procedure room, basic lab equipment. Nothing fancy, but functional. It's perfect, Liana replied, and meant it. After the high-tech hospitals where she had trained, the simplicity of this small-town clinic felt exactly right. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and planning. Her medical license had been updated, malpractice insurance arranged, and equipment ordered. The town council had unanimously approved her application to practice in Seabrook, with several members noting that the recent harbor disaster had proven how desperately they needed additional medical coverage. But the most meaningful endorsement had come from the survivors themselves. 36 of the 39 people rescued from the Seabrook Queen had sent letters supporting her application, describing how her medical expertise had made the difference in their treatment and recovery. Robert Chen, the man whose leg she had saved with emergency surgery, had returned to Seabrook the previous week to thank her personally. His recovery was proceeding well, and doctors in Portland had confirmed that her quick action had prevented permanent disability. "Dr. Rodriguez," he had said, gripping her hands tightly, "you gave me my life back, my leg, my ability to work, my future, all of it. How do I thank someone for that?" "You don't need to thank me," she had replied. "Just keep doing your physical therapy and get better." But his words had meant more than he could know. For 3 years, Liana had focused on the 4 people she hadn't been able to save in San Miguel. Robert Chen reminded her that there were also people alive and healthy because of her skills. Tom Bradley appeared in the doorway of the future clinic, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing his usual good-natured grin. "So, doctor, when do you hang up your fishing nets for good?" "I'm not giving up fishing entirely," Liana said with a smile. "Early morning fishing, medical practice in the afternoon and evening. Best of both worlds." "You know," Tom said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what happened 2 weeks ago. All those years I worked alongside you, never knowing you were a doctor, makes me wonder how many other people are hiding important parts of themselves." It was a perceptive observation. During her years in hiding, Liana had assumed she was the only one carrying painful secrets. But the response to her revelation had shown her that many people in Seabrook had complex histories they rarely discussed. Margaret Walsh had told her that she had once been a nurse in Vietnam, an experience she rarely mentioned because the memories were too difficult. Jim Martinez, who ran the hardware store, had been a combat medic in the Gulf War. Sarah Thompson, the librarian, had a PhD in marine biology, but had left academic research after a bitter dispute with her department head. "People reinvent themselves all the time," Liana observed. "Sometimes running from something, sometimes running toward something better." "And sometimes," Dr. Peterson added, they find out they don't need to run anymore. The bell above the door chimed as Emma Walsh entered the future clinic, accompanied by her grandmother Margaret. The 12-year-old looked completely recovered from her ordeal in the harbor, her cheeks pink with health and her eyes bright with curiosity. "Dr. Rodriguez!" she called out excitedly. "Grandma brought me to see your new office." "What do you think?" Liana asked, gesturing around the empty space. Emma walked through the rooms, her imagination clearly filling in the missing furniture and equipment. "It's going to be perfect. Are you going to have a fish tank in the waiting room?" "That's actually not a bad idea," Liana said with amusement, "though I was thinking more along the lines of magazines and comfortable chairs." Margaret smiled at her granddaughter's enthusiasm, then addressed Liana more seriously. "The town is really excited about having you as our doctor, but I hope you know that people also understand the weight of what you're taking on." "What do you mean?" "Being the doctor in a small town isn't just a job, it's a calling. People will depend on you not just for medical care, but for comfort, guidance, and reassurance. It can be overwhelming sometimes." Liana nodded thoughtfully. She had experienced that responsibility before, in the mountain villages where she had worked early in her career. The difference was that now she had the support of a community that had already seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to trust her anyway. "I think I'm ready for that," she said quietly. "I know you are," Margaret replied. "The way you handled the crisis 2 weeks ago, working with everyone as a team instead of trying to carry all the responsibility yourself, that showed real wisdom." As the afternoon wore on, more townspeople stopped by to see the future clinic and offer their support. The local newspaper editor wanted to do a feature story about Seabrook's new doctor. The Chamber of Commerce offered to help with promotion and community outreach. The high school principal asked if she would be willing to give talks about medical careers to interested students. Each interaction reinforced what Liana was beginning to understand. She wasn't just joining this community as a medical professional, she was becoming part of its fabric, connected to the people not just as patients, but as neighbors and friends. As evening approached and the visitors thinned out, Liana found herself alone in the empty clinic, watching the sun set over the harbor through the large front windows. Her fishing boat was visible at its mooring, a reminder of the simpler life she had built here. But simplicity, she was learning, didn't have to mean isolation. And taking responsibility for people's health didn't have to mean carrying the burden alone. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Jennifer Kim, the trauma surgeon who had come with the Coast Guard helicopter during the rescue. They had stayed in touch over the past 2 weeks, and Dr. Kim had become an unexpected source of professional support and encouragement. "Heard through the medical grapevine that you're opening a practice in Seabrook. Congratulations! If you ever need a consultant or want to refer complex cases, I'm always available. The way you handled that mass casualty event was impressive. Reminded me why I love working with rural physicians. You folks see everything and handle it with grace." The message meant more to Liana than Doctor. Kim probably realized. Professional respect from a colleague, offered freely and without judgment about her 3-year absence from medicine. As she locked up the future clinic and headed home, Liana stopped at the harbor to check on her boat. The Silent Grace needed some maintenance work, and she enjoyed the peaceful ritual of caring for the vessel that had been her refuge during the difficult years. As she worked, Tom Bradley appeared on the dock, having finished securing his own boat for the night. "Liana," he said, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure. Do you ever regret the years you spent hiding? The time away from medicine?" She considered the question carefully. "I used to think of it as time wasted, but now I'm not so sure. Those years taught me things about myself that I couldn't have learned in a hospital. Patience, acceptance, the value of simple work well done. I think they made me a better person, and probably a better doctor. Tom nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that's why you were able to handle the crisis so well. You weren't just the doctor. You were also the fisherman, the neighbor, the person who understood what it meant to be part of this community. It was another perceptive observation. During the rescue and its aftermath, Liana had drawn on all her experiences. Medical training, yes, but also the practical skills she had learned from fishing, the patience she had developed during her years of isolation, and the deep understanding of teamwork that came from working alongside people like Tom on the water. I think you're right, she said. All of it. The medical school, the years in the mountains, the tragedy, the exile, the fishing. It was all preparation for what happened 2 weeks ago. As they walked away from the harbor, Tom made one final comment that stayed with her for days afterward. You know, Liana, most people think heroes are the ones who never fail, who always save everyone. But I think real heroes are the ones who fail, learn from it, and find the courage to try again when it matters most. That night, as Liana prepared for bed in her small apartment, she opened the drawer where she had kept her medical diploma hidden for 3 years. Tomorrow, she would take it to be framed and hung in her new clinic, not as a symbol of past achievement, but as a promise of future service. Outside her window, the harbor lights reflected on the calm water, and the town of Seabrook settled into its peaceful evening routine. In 6 weeks, Dr. Liana Rodriguez would officially rejoin the medical profession, but she already knew that the real healing, both for her patients and for herself, had already begun. The woman who had run from responsibility had become someone ready to embrace it again, not as a burden to be carried alone, but as a trust to be shared with a community that had taught her the true meaning of support, forgiveness, and second chances. 6 months later, the morning sun slanted through the windows of the Seabrook Community Medical Clinic as Dr. Liana Rodriguez finished reviewing her patient charts for the day. At 53, she had found a rhythm that balanced her medical practice with her continued love of fishing, and for the first time in years, she felt completely at peace with her life. Her first patient of the day was Emma Walsh, coming in for a routine checkup. The now 13-year-old had become something of a regular visitor, not because of any health problems, but because she had developed a fascination with medicine that Liana suspected might lead to a future career in healthcare. Dr. Rodriguez, Emma said as she settled onto the exam table. I've been reading about emergency medicine. Do you think I could be a doctor someday? I think you could be anything you set your mind to, Liana replied warmly. What interests you most about medicine? The way you can help people when they're scared and hurt, like you helped me that night in the harbor. Liana smiled as she checked Emma's blood pressure and listened to her heart and lungs, all perfectly normal for a healthy teenager. But the girl's words reminded her of how much had changed since that stormy night 6 months ago. The Seabrook Community Medical Clinic had become a vital part of the town's infrastructure. Liana worked 3 days a week in the clinic, seeing patients with everything from routine checkups to minor injuries to chronic disease management. The other 2 weekdays, she still went out on the Silent Grace, fishing the waters she knew so well. Dr. Peterson had initially worried that part-time practice wouldn't be enough to meet the community's needs, but the arrangement had worked perfectly. When Liana was on the water, she was available by radio for emergencies, and her fishing schedule was flexible enough to accommodate urgent medical needs. The integration of her 2 careers had been surprisingly natural. The patience she had learned from fishing served her well with difficult patients. The weather reading skills that made her a successful fisherman translated into an intuitive ability to read people's moods and concerns. And the physical demands of working on the water had kept her in excellent shape for the demanding work of rural medicine. More importantly, the community had embraced her completely. The people of Seabrook had seen her at her most vulnerable moment, when her hidden past was revealed, and they had chosen to judge her not by her failures, but by her willingness to help when help was needed most. Dr. Rodriguez, Emma continued, my grandmother says you're writing a book about what happened that night. Is that true? I'm working on something, Liana admitted. Not exactly a book, more like a manual for small communities dealing with mass casualty events. Ways to coordinate medical resources, triage protocols for non-medical personnel, that sort of thing. It was a project that had grown out of her analysis of the Seabrook Queen rescue. While the response had been largely successful, she had identified several areas where better preparation and coordination could have saved precious minutes and possibly more lives. The manual was being reviewed by emergency management officials at the state level, and there was talk of adapting it for use in coastal communities throughout the region. It felt good to turn her experience with disaster response into something that could help other communities prepare for similar emergencies. After Emma's appointment, Liana had a brief lull in her schedule, which she used to step outside and check on the harbor. The Silent Grace was visible at her mooring, ready for an afternoon fishing trip that would combine business with pleasure. The boat had become something of a local landmark. Tour groups often asked about the doctor's fishing boat, and the story of the rescue had become part of Seabrook's local lore. Liana had mixed feelings about the attention, but she understood that people found inspiration in the idea that everyone had hidden depths and unexpected capabilities. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Kim in Portland. Heard about the manual you're writing. Very interested in collaborating on the trauma response sections. Coffee next week when you're in the city? The connection with Dr. Kim had evolved into a valuable professional relationship. Liana consulted on complex cases, participated in telemedicine conferences with the Portland trauma team, and had even been invited to present a paper on rural emergency medicine at a state medical conference. The professional recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more was the knowledge that she was back where she belonged, using her skills to help people, contributing to her community, and finding meaning in work that made a difference. As she prepared for her next patient, Liana reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The tragedy in San Miguel would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the defining chapter. She had learned that healing, both for doctors and patients, was rarely about perfect outcomes. It was about showing up, doing your best, and accepting that sometimes your best was enough, even when it wasn't everything. The afternoon brought a mixed caseload. A fisherman with an infected cut on his hand, an elderly woman with diabetes management questions, and a teenager with anxiety about starting college. Each patient presented different challenges, but Liana approached them all with the same calm competence that had served her well during the harbor rescue. As her clinic day ended, she changed into her fishing clothes and headed for the harbor. The evening fishing trip was both recreation and business. She still sold her catch to local restaurants, maintaining her connection to the fishing community that had sheltered her during her years in exile. Tom Bradley was preparing his own boat for an evening run when she arrived at the dock. Over the past 6 months, their friendship had deepened as he had come to understand the full scope of what she had overcome to return to medicine. "How was the clinic today, Doc?" he asked with a grin. "Good. Emma Walsh is still talking about becoming a doctor. I think she's serious about it. That kid's smart enough to do anything. Having you as an example probably doesn't hurt." As they worked side by side, preparing their boats for the evening fishing, Liana marveled at how natural this dual existence had become. She was equally comfortable with a stethoscope and a fishing net, equally at home in the clinic and on the water. The Silent Grace puttered out of the harbor as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Liana felt the familiar peace that came with being on the water, the gentle rhythm of the waves and the whisper of wind providing a counterpoint to the intensity of medical practice. As she anchored at her favorite fishing spot, Liana's phone rang. Dr. Peterson's number appeared on the screen. "Liana, I hate to bother you during your fishing time, but we've got a situation at the hospital. Multi-vehicle accident on the coast highway, several casualties coming in. Could use your help if you're available." Without hesitation, she started the boat's engine. "I'm 20 minutes out. What do we know about the injuries?" As the Silent Grace raced back toward harbor, Liana felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with medical emergencies. But this time, it wasn't accompanied by the crushing weight of sole responsibility that had haunted her in San Miguel. This time, she was part of a team, rushing to help people who needed their combined skills and experience. She wasn't alone with the burden of life and death decisions. She was one professional among many, each contributing their expertise to give patients the best possible chance of recovery. The harbor lights grew brighter as she approached the dock, and Liana could see the flashing lights of ambulances at the hospital. Another emergency. Another chance to use her skills in service of her community. As she tied up the boat and ran toward her car, Liana thought about how different this felt from the terrified young doctor who had fled San Miguel 3 years earlier. That woman had been crushed by the weight of expectations and the impossibility of perfect outcomes. Dr. Liana Rodriguez, who had learned to balance medicine with fishing, responsibility with acceptance, and professional skill with community support, was ready for whatever challenges waited at the hospital. She had finally learned that being a healer wasn't about saving everyone. It was about bringing all your skill, knowledge, and compassion to each situation, and trusting that your best effort, combined with the efforts of others, would be enough. As she drove through the quiet streets of Seabrook toward the hospital, Liana smiled at the thought of what lay ahead. More patients to treat, more lives to touch, more opportunities to make a difference in the world. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, surrounded by a community that had taught her the true meaning of redemption, second chances, and the courage to try again. The woman who had once run from medicine had finally found her way home. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.